Welcome everyone to the first lecture of our course, Women's Worlds of Native America and Africa. I will provide you with as many of these, what I sometimes call video lectures. They're really just voiceover PowerPoint slide lectures, but I'll provide as many of them as I can this term. Some students find that they like to hear me narrate the slides. Others prefer to simply read the slides of the PowerPoint on their own. So you can choose for yourself which you find more useful. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll break up the PowerPoint lectures if they're long, break them into more easily managed pieces so that the typical video lecture version, say, will go from 25 to 35 minutes. So we start here today with Women's Worlds of Native America and Africa. This is really the entry point now for our course on women in American history. And it makes sense to ask right at the very beginning, I think, where do we expect to find women in history? We might even ask, is women's history the same history as men's history? After all, we've separated this course, the history of women in America, into its own curriculum, into its own model of inquiry. And in doing so, are we suggesting that somehow women's history is different than men's history? Is it separate and apart from men's history? Well, we are certainly taking a particular focus on women's history, but ultimately I'm going to argue that where we find women's history, we find history. That is, rather than being a separate category unto itself, women's history, despite our particular focus on it, we've chosen to focus specifically on it, is actually history in the same sense as men's history. And I'm going to take about the next many weeks to try and convince you that that is indeed the case. What does it mean to define the lives and experiences of women throughout time as history? In other words, if we're going to suggest that women's history is history, then what does it mean to define the lives and experiences of women as history? That's obviously a question that we're going to spend a lot of time looking into throughout our course. Now, all of this comes to mind, I think, because of the way typically history has been defined. That is, primarily as the past affairs of men, and typically of great men, famous men, powerful men. Men like Napoleon Bonaparte here, who's shown in a characteristically heroic pose atop his steed, crossing the Alps in a military campaign for the conquest of empire. So it might seem a little bit over the top, but I found it to be a fitting emblem for how we often assume history to be. That is, the affairs of not just men, but great men. But if we see history that way, it's fair to ask, I think, what is it that we're seeing? And what is it that we are missing? What's missing from the picture? The English author Jane Austen wrote in the 19th century, "But real history, real solemn history, I cannot be interested in. The quarrels of popes and kings, with wars and pestilences in every page. The men all so good for nothing, and hardly any women at all." So there was Jane Austen's pointed critique, you might say, of that traditional history as being concerned with the affairs of great men. But you know, the simplest answer to the question, what are we missing if we focus exclusively on the affairs of great men? The simplest answer is we're missing half the human population. Women are not a minority within the story of history, not in numerical terms. They constitute half of the human population. And so to miss them in history, to overlook them in history, would take a deliberate act. It would take a deliberate omission. Because otherwise, if we simply walk back into the past, we ought to see women at every turn, just as you walking down the halls of your community college or across the floor where you work or driving through a parking lot or a freeway or turning on a television set, you would expect certainly to find women at every turn. But it's interesting how that simple fact gets turned upside down, gets distorted. Let's think again about the subject that we are covering this semester. That is the history of women in the Americas and in what becomes the United States of America particularly. We all know the story of Columbus's discovering of America, and that's usually the word that has been associated with the act of Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492, leading what would become a European wave of discovery of the Americas. But what I want to suggest here now is that before we get too carried away with our mythic notions of the past, that discovery itself was a fiction of the European imagination, framed by mostly male fantasies of a virgin America. You want to see evidence of that? I got evidence for you. This remarkable painting by Theodore Gaillet called America and done in the year 1580 had been based on an earlier drawing by the Dutchman Jan van der Straat. And it came to emblemize, you might say, this fantasy vision, this male fantasy vision of America itself, both of discovery and discovery of America itself. Here we see not Columbus, but his contemporary Amerigo Vespucci discovering America. And how is America depicted? America is depicted as a naked woman laying on a hammock. A naked woman laying on a hammock who is now aroused, you might say, by the arrival of the European man. Look, what it means to be male or female in cultural terms, not just in biological terms or genetic terms, but in cultural terms. That is how we as a society and culture look upon the meaning of male and female. That's what we call gender. That's what we mean by gender. Gender is a construct of culture. It's something we make up. And gender was made up by the cultures of those Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans whose paths would cross beginning in the 15th century. What it meant to be woman, what it meant to be man, what it meant to be female or male in cultural terms was in effect a decision arrived at by people, and in many cases by men who held power to define, whether political, economic, power to define the meaning of gender and gender roles. And from the very beginning of America's contact with Europe, not only were the relative terms of civilization and wilderness defined, constructed, but so too were the terms male and female, masculine and feminine also made up. And as you can see here, made up in the fantasy version of the European male, the mind of the European male, who sees himself as a discoverer. You can read into that whatever you want, of a naked America, feminized, naked America, laying prone before him. Well, okay, yeah, you can imagine what happens next in this narrative. You know, we'd be tempted to laugh this off, except we know what does happen next. We'll spend the next several weeks talking and discussing about what happens next. But if we step back from these fantasies, these mythologies of virgins and potent male discoverers, what we find is a very different story. If we stick to the evidence, if we stick to the facts of the past as they reveal themselves to us in our search for greater meaning beyond the mere cultural fantasies, what we find is a rediscovered America. Not the America so-called discovered by Columbus or Vespucci or others, but a rediscovered America. And guess where that rediscovering America leads us? It leads us to a young woman. Not a fantasy, not a sexual object of the male imagination. Included among the human bones found in an undersea cave, a cave now below the waterline along the coast of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, a cave that once sat above the waterline and provided habitation for early American people. Here in this cave, archaeologists found the remains of what was once a young woman. And through the arts of archaeological reconstruction or forensic reconstruction, dating back now 15,500 years, these skeletal fragments can be reimagined and rediscovered in ways that are far closer to their original condition, not through the prism of male imagination, not through the prism of potent, libidinous European discoverers, but through the lens of science. It seems that the first American, at least as far as the fossil evidence has yet to tell us, the first American we have found was a young woman who lived 15,500 years ago. And so I don't think it's too much to say then that American history, the real American history, begins with a woman. The first American. Contrary to the fantasies of Europeans, Native America was not an untouched, virgin wilderness. This map gives us a general view of just how much work was done by pre-Columbian native peoples, that is, the native peoples of America who lived here for thousands of years prior to the arrival of Europeans. And the work they did in their various societies to remake the landscapes of the Western Hemisphere. And you can see in the key down here, everything from husbandry and agriculture to clearing by fire, agroforestry, irrigation works, terracing works, and other earthworks. Everywhere you see the dots and lines and colorations on the map, there you find vast expanses of the Western Hemisphere that were not left simply virgin or untouched, but rather had been reworked, remade, reimagined, and reconstructed for the needs of the peoples who for thousands of years lived here. What we'll call the re-engineering of landscapes so often associated with the very idea of civilization. I mean, the basic definition of civilization is man's re-engineering of landscapes to suit his purpose. But notice the pronoun his. Typically, civilization has been seen as a male endeavor, with women being somehow adjunct or ancillary to the main work of it. But nothing could be further from the truth. No matter how that vision might fulfill the fantasies of certain male propagandists through time, what we know, based on actual evidence, is that women were at the heart of the civilizing project. The re-engineering of landscapes was women's work in the Americas. 9,000 years ago, maize was domesticated in Mexico and tended by women. By 5,000 years ago, women were cultivating gardens in North America. The essential staff of life, the essential produce needed to sustain organized civilizations. That labor was provided again and again throughout time, over thousands of years, across the Americas by women. Here's a sketch drawing that goes back to the time of European contact with the Americas that shows women together, their labor is joined around the cooking platforms and shelling platforms that enabled them to turn the agriculture into consumable food. Even as the young children remained nearby them, this women's work combined both the domestic, therefore, and the productive elements necessary for supporting their societies. Yeah, much of the labor of American history, certainly prior to the arrival of Europeans, was carried out by women. There's no escaping that fact. The Europeans themselves were struck by it. And though the European artist Theodore de Bry used Renaissance-style depictions of human form here, the image clearly shows native women working the land to prepare their food crops. De Bry's sketch, done in 1590, within the first century of Columbus's contact with the Americas, shows native women in the fields harvesting and sowing and planting the necessary food crops to sustain their civilizations. Other similar scenes. A later sketch, for example, from 1724 by the French Jesuit Joseph-François Lafitau, shows native women working the land in corn planting and tapping trees to get maple for the cooking of maple sugar. So exacting labor, skilled labor, hard labor, work for women in the sustaining of American civilizations. And here's why it matters. Without this labor, without this pre-European chapter in our history, modern world history would be very, very different. And women are central to this history. Look, 15th century Europeans of Columbus's day, of Vespucci's day, lacked the organization, tools, and economic resources to have conquered a wilderness. Because that's what they claimed they did, remember, a virgin wilderness, brought now under the civilizing influence of Europeans. But nothing could be more of a distortion, more of a misrepresentation. They could not have undertaken such a job under any circumstances because they lacked the resources to do so. Most of these European states, Spain and Portugal, for example, were themselves poor countries, only just now emerging from centuries of occupied rule by the Islamic peoples of North Africa and Arabia, the Moors. Within just a few short years of Columbus's first voyage, the first of those European encounters, transatlantic encounters with the Americas, only within a short time preceding that voyage had the last of the Moors been driven by the Christian soldiers, the Spanish and Portuguese soldiers, from the Iberian Peninsula. And much of the wealth, therefore, going with it, because it had been the Moors who had brought civilization and wealth and trade in the post-Roman world to the Iberian Peninsula, and thus leaving behind from their exodus a rather poor, a rather undeveloped state. And so, no, Spain or Portugal or even the other European nations such as England and France could have on their own carried out the enormous project of civilizing the Americas. But they didn't have to, because that's not what they found in the New World, a virgin wilderness, an undeveloped wilderness. In truth, environmental engineering in North America had been going on for centuries, even millennia. That is, for thousands of years. And in place of a wilderness, Native American peoples had long ago created a hospitable environment into which European crops, animals, and European people could then embed themselves. In other words, much of the work and all of the necessary work had already been done by the arrival of the Europeans. And so we have to get our minds around that history to understand and have an accurate understanding of how history will proceed from the point of the European arrival forward. And the picture we get when we clear away the propaganda and the fantasies is a picture of tremendous diversity, of pre-Columbian American history featuring a wide variety of cultures from Alaska in the north to South America. Consider when Europeans arrived in the 1500s, at least 12 major centers of distinctive civilization existed in the Western Hemisphere. In 1492, an estimated 43 to 65 million people inhabited the Americas, accounting for about 1/5 of the Earth's human population. In Mexico alone, 7 to 9 million people lived in what is now our Southwest and California. And they spoke at least 375 distinct languages. There were 50 languages spoken in California alone. Coming to terms with the history of women in America means coming to terms with the history of America before Columbus, before the Europeans. It means acknowledging that the pre-Columbian peoples of America built great civilizations, and that among the chief builders of these civilizations was the labor and cultural authority of women. Our task is twofold today. Both understand the true relationship of history before the European arrival, that is the American history before the European arrival, and the history of American women before the arrival of European. And what we can see right away is that women were at the center of this history. This figure was sculpted and shaped by an artisan some 3,500 years ago in what is now Mexico. 3,500 years ago, an iconic image of a woman created by an artist stands before us still with the basic reminder: you can only lose women in history if you shut your eyes to them. From North America and the Mississippi Basin cultures The Mississippi was a great artery fed by the Missouri and Arkansas and Ohio and other rivers, a great watershed that served as a central axis for trade and commerce and culture among pre-Columbian native people, the so-called mound-building cultures, because of the prevalence of earthen mounds, part of that re-engineering of the landscape I mentioned. These mounds could serve as burial mounds or ceremonial mounds, the most famous of them, the largest of them, at Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis, Missouri. You see the artist's conception of Cahokia, the center of a Mississippi trade culture that reached a peak around the 1200s CE. That is, 300 years before the arrival of Columbus and the Europeans. And everywhere you see the red squares, there were major settlements connected to the river trade of the Ohio River, the Missouri River, the Arkansas River, and of course the Mississippi, connecting them all to the Gulf of Mexico. Here's what Cahokia looks like today, the so-called Monk's Mound. If you're passing by, like this car, on the highway and you didn't know better, you might think it was a natural earthen formation, but it wasn't. It was hand-created, one basket of earth at a time, by generations of laborers who, through the wealth and resources of their ruling power, a power that dominated the trade of the Mississippi, was able to commission a great and monumental work as a kind of shining testament to the accomplishments of their civilization. And Cahokia would be the most populated city in North America until Philadelphia finally surpassed it in the 19th century. To the engineered landscapes of South America, some of the most forbidding environmental terrains anywhere on Earth. In both the coastal and highland regions of Peru, for example, great civilizations resided. Long before the Inca, long before the arrival of the Europeans, the Chavin culture originated at the crossroads of East and West in Peru, developing a distinctive architecture, sculpture, painted textiles, and pottery. But the Chavin were one of several neighboring civilizations that over time, like the layers of an onion, would cover the land and cover the history of South America. Constructed cities in some of the most challenging environments. The Tiwanaku raised field agriculture above, and the Wari terrace agriculture carved right into the mountainside below. Centuries before the Inca Empire of Peru, there were the civilizations known as the Tiwanaku and the Wari. Located in western Bolivia and Peru, they comprised a network of cities that featured grand architecture and large populations. Tiwanaku and Wari exploited the extreme climate differences of the Pacific coastal plain, the Altiplano or high plains, and the rugged Andes Mountains to combine a fishing industry, fruit, vegetable, and grain production from the highlands. In other words, an integrated food economy from the Andes to the coastal plains. The Tiwanaku and Wari mastered their environment, reworking the challenging environments of modern-day Bolivia and Peru that leave us still today stunned as tourists when we revisit them. Great civilizations resided here, hundreds and hundreds of years before European arrival. And their cultural accomplishments, drawing lines in the earth to create a landscaped civilization of geometry, art, and ritual. The landscape drawings of the Nazca people along the southern coast of Peru features animals such as a monkey, a pelican, a hummingbird, and the famous dog that you see here. These are effigy figures carved right into the earth, seen from an aerial view, spanning across 1,000 geometric symbols and arrow straight lines extending many, many miles. The images were constructed by groups of native people, not extraterrestrials, not mysterious lost races, but Native American people, the ancestors of the people who live there today. It was they who moved the dark surface stones to expose the lighter colored earth beneath. We don't know everything that we might know about the literal purpose and meaning of these great figures. But what we do know is they could not have been created without an absolute mastery of mathematics, of engineering, and the centralized organization of labor projects sufficient to carry them out. You know, civilizations often boast of their great public works. In America, a Mount Rushmore or a Washington Monument. For the Nazca, it was the great earthen drawings, the great sketches that left their signature. Even in places that Europeans regarded as primordial virgin wilderness, even there is evidence that native peoples engineered landscapes to support their populations. Again, looking down from above today, the geoglyphs of Acre, found in a deforested area of Brazil, show that native peoples engineered landscapes in the Amazon rainforest to suit their needs by clearing trees and building geometrically precise agricultural terraces to produce